Okay, good morning, guys. So, as we all know, this would be the last class for CSS, and for the last class, I decided to, that we should go on into CSS combinators, pseudo elements, and classes. So, after this section, we'll just go briefly into what a web layout is, and right after that, we'll go into the assignments without wasting time. So for now, this is what we have for today's class: CSS combinators, pseudo elements, and pseudo classes. So let's quickly move on. So now, for the first section of today's class, we have the CSS combinators. So under this section, we'll get to know what a combinator is. We'll get to know how it works. We'll get to know the syntax and the types of combinators we have in CSS. So what is a CSS combinator? A CSS combinator describes the relationship between two or more selectors. So as we all know, we've been using selectors over the course of time now in learning CSS. And most of the selectors we've used are actually just a single selector. But here with a combinator, you can actually get to use more than one selector at a time. And the combinator here actually describes the relationship between the two or more chosen selectors. So a selector can be a simple selector or a complex selector, which by complex selector will mean that it consists of more than one selector connected by combinators. So the one we are familiar with now is just a simple selector, which is just one. But now we'll get to know how to use more than one selector at a time. So here we have the types of combinators in CSS. So there are four types of combinators available in CSS and they can be seen below. So right here you're actually seeing the selector type and also the combinator. So for the first one we have the descendant selector, which uses the space combinator. By that I mean like a space, just like creating a kind of space between the selector. The next selector we have is the child selector, which uses the greater than greater than combinator. Next, we have the adjacent sibling selector, which makes use of the addition combinator. And lastly, we have the general sibling selector, which makes use of the slide combinator. So here the four combinators are actually the space combinator, the greater than combinator, the addition combinator, and the slide combinator. So each of these combinator actually has a particular selector that can be used with them. So we'll be seeing how this each of these selector make use of each of the combinators on the screen. So for the first selector, we have the descendant selector. So the descendant selector is used to select all the descendant elements of a specific element. So that's basically what this selector does. It selects all the descendants. So by that we mean that the descendant elements do not necessarily need to be direct descendants, but in as much as they are within that um other elements, it can actually select it through the space combinator. And this selector makes use of the space combinator in terms of how it wants to select the descendant element. So here on this screen we have the syntax and the example of the descendant selector. So as you can see on the syntax part, it begins with the parent selector, which is the selector that contains the descendant selector, or what you would call the children selector or element. So the parent selector comes first, after which you have a space, and then it's followed by the child selector, and in between the curly braces you can have your CSS styling codes. And as you can see in the example on the right hand side of the screen, we have the div selector, which is a name selector. And after the div selector is a space in between. That's it's the div selector comes first, then a space, and then the p selector or the p element. So here it is obvious to know that the div tag is the parent selector here, and the p here is actually the descendant selector. I mean the descendant element. So by using this particular syntax, any paragraph tag that is within a p tag, either directly or within another tag that is also within that div tag, it would actually select it would actually style the p tag there. And so here we have some basic CSS code, the color property attached with the value of red, and also the background property attached with blue. Now, this particular styling would affect every p tag within a div tag, both the ones that are direct descendants of the div tag and the ones that are within another tag that is within that div tag. So that's how the descendant selector actually works, and we'll get to see this later on when we get to the practical session of this class. So next we have the child selector. So the child selector is used to select all elements that are immediate children of a particular element. Now, this kind of sounds similar to what the descendant selector actually does, but the only difference here is that the child selector is used to select only the elements that are immediate children of that particular element. So that basically means if you have an element within another element and you try to, style it, it's not going to work. And this particular selector makes use of the greater than combinator. So here we have the syntax and an example of the child selector. And in the syntax, you can see that it also begins with the parent selector, which is then followed by the greater than sign, and then the child selector. And between the curly braces, you have your CSS styling codes. So here in the example, you can also see the same thing with making, reference with the div and the p selector. So here, what this actually does is that any p element that is within a div tag immediately would actually get styled using this. So unlike the descendant selector, which can actually style all types of p tags, even if it's within another element that is within that div, here it would only style the p tag that is directly, within the div. So this would basically mean that if you have a paragraph element within another element that is within this div, it's not going to get styled using this selector at all. So the only way to style that would be to use the descendant selector. But here the child selector only makes reference to the immediate children of that parent element. So also we have some basic, codes, the color giving the value of red and background of blue. So we'll be seeing all this later on VS Code. For the third selector, we have the adjacent sibling selector. The adjacent sibling selector is used to select an element that comes directly after a particular or specified element. Now, this particular selector is quite different from the descendant and the child selector, because the descendant and the child selector actually style whatever element is within themselves, but just in, different ways. But for this selector, it styles an element that comes directly after the specified element. So this actually means that the element does not is not going to be within that specified element. It's going to be outside that element. So with the addition combinator, the adjacent sibling selector would use that to style that element that comes after. And I would also explain this again when we get to, our example. Okay, so here we have the syntax and the example for the adjacent sibling selector. So I think we have a typo here. Sorry for that. But then where you see the greater than sign is meant to actually be the addition sign. So you normally would have the parent selector, then the addition sign, then after that it's followed by the child selector and your CSS site styling codes. And we can also see that in the example too. So forget about the greater than sign. That's just a typo, probably because I rushed too much. But then what is meant to be there is just the plus sign. So what this would do is that since the div is the parent selector and the p element is the child selector, this would actually style any paragraph that comes after any div element. So that basically means that whatever paragraph that comes before the div or that is within a div is not going to get styled except it comes after the div element. And you can see some basic stylings, color, and background. So we'll be trying all of this out, on VS Code. So you'd see how they actually work and how they perform. So for the last selector, we have the general sibling selector. The general sibling selector is used to select elements that come next after a specified element. So this kind of sounds similar to the adjacent sibling selector, but then they are quite different. So this only selects elements that come next after a specified element. So that basically means both the elements that comes directly before and after that particular element would actually get styled using this selector. And this selector makes use of the title combinator, the slide combinator. So here we have the syntax for the general sibling selector. All the selectors basically have similar syntax. The only difference here is just the combinator, which you can see here to be the slide combinator. And in the example, we have the div, which is the parent selector, and also the p tag, which is the child selector here. So this would only style the elements that come directly next to the specified element. So whatever p tag that comes directly before a div tag and directly after it would actually get styled in this particular selector. So without wasting much of our time, let's try this out on VS Code and we'll see how they all perform in their different ways. Here we have combinators, new folder for this. HTML file comes first and then our CSS. Okay, probably need to zoom in a bit. Okay, yeah. So here we'll be having multiple p tags and div tags. So you would actually see how each of these selectors actually work, and also with the combinators. So for the first combinator, we'll be having the descendant selector, which makes use of the space combinator. We have some p tags. We're going to have multiple div tags, which would have p tags within them. And mind you, this doesn't only work with p tags; it can actually work for any other tag. So I think for the sake of this, we would actually have multiple tags. So let's have heading tags, also p tags. So now we have three div tags that have heading tags and p tags within them. Connect this with our CSS file. Okay, so now to make use of the space combinator, our parent selector would be a div, and which is followed by a space and then the p tag. And for this, we want to have a background of blue. Now, like I said before, this particular styling isn't going to affect all the p tags. It's only going to affect the ones within the div tags. So we can probably also change the color of the text to white. Yeah, that should be enough. So now we'll open this with our VS Code. And before then, let's actually see the number of p tags we should expect with blue background. So this is one, this is two, then this is three, and this is four. So we actually have a total of six paragraph tags in this entire document, but then we expect just four of them to have that styling. So if we should right click, open with live server, and yeah, here you have it. So now we have exactly four paragraph tags with a background of blue, and the color of the text is actually in white. So like I also said, this particular selector and the combinator would also style a p tag that is also within another element inside the div tag. So let's try something like that. So within this div tag, we are going to have another element, the span tag. Inside the span tag, we have p tag. We also have some other tags. Let's have a small tag. So now we would expect the number of paragraphs with that background to be up to 6 on the screen. So saving this and going back to our browser, now you can see that the numbers have actually increased. So now we have 6 paragraph tags with background of blue color and text of white. So this is how the descendant selector actually works, and this is how it uses the space combinator. So also this actually works with class name and not just the name selector. So we can also do that if we give this a class name. Call this div2 to be dot div2. So saving this, we would only expect the p tags within this particular div to retain that background. So now about 3 tags would be losing that and would have just 3 left. And yeah, that's how it works. So now we have 3 p tags that actually have the same background and the same color of their text. So I also guess we can override this even when we have declared the p tags generally to have a style. So here would give a general div. We are still making use of the space combinator. So here the background color would be red, and if we save this, you should expect that all p tags within div tags except for the one that has this class name would actually pop out in red background. And yeah, so that's how it actually works. So you can see that all the p tags within div tags without a class name would show in red, but once they have the class name of div2, it would actually override the first styling and give it a background of blue. So that's how it works with the space combinator and also the descendant selector. So now we'll be looking into the next selector, which is the child selector. And as I said before, this particular one actually styles the immediate child of that particular element. So going back here, we would give this the greater than sign, comment this out for now. And if we save this, you can see now that we have just 4 paragraph tags with red background. And why is because of this. So now this particular paragraph that we have here is a direct child of this div here. This particular paragraph that we also have here is a direct child of this div here. That's this one. But then this paragraph tag we have here is a direct descendant of this span tag, which is a direct descendant of this div tag. So this is the reason why the child selector cannot select this p tag that we have here. And likewise, this p tag we have within this small tags, this p tag is a direct descendant of this small tag, which is a direct descendant of this div. So in this case, using the um, addition combinator, it's not going to work. But here we have direct p tags, children of this, and also a direct child of this div, which is this p tag. So basically, we have 4 paragraph tags that are direct children of the div, but then the remaining two are actually direct um children of other elements who are now direct children of the div tag. So that's how the child selector works. And we can also use the the class name for this too. So comment this out. So this particular styling, mind you, it doesn't just affect backgrounds and color, but your styling in general. So anything you want to style with, you can actually use this to do it generally. That's all round. But then for the sake of this, I'm just going to go through some basic styling and not waste much of our time. So here would have a direct p tag, and within this div that has a class name, you would only expect this to be the only element here to be styled, and this one, but these two wouldn't be. So if we save this and save our CSS, come back to our browser, now we just have this. Okay, so I'm guessing something's up. Okay, yes, and that's because it's still using the space combinator. So if we give this the greater than symbol, this should change and would have just two paragraphs with the blue background. Yes, so this is actually how the child selector works. So it only works with direct and immediate children. So the moment the child selector is within another selector, it's not going to perform any styling to it at all. So the next one we have is the adjacent sibling selector. So for this, we'll be commenting this out. We'll also be making use of this again. Only difference now is that we would actually change this to the plus symbol. And if we save this, we would only have children coming after the div to be styled. So let's see if we have that here already. So here we are going to put some p tags. So now every div tag has at least a paragraph tag before it, that's here, and after it. So within before this div is this set of p tags, which are two in number, and then we have one below it. Likewise, before and after this div is one here and one here, and also this last div has one p tag and another p tag here. So if we save this and go back to our browser, now we have three paragraph tags that are in red background. So what this basically means is that we have three p tags that come after every div tag. So this is how this works. So for the first p tag, it's actually this particular one, and this one comes directly after this div that we have here. But then this one also has another p tag that comes directly after this div, which is this p tag we have here. And lastly, this is the last p tag that comes after the div tag. So you can see that after the three div tags, there is always a p tag after it, which makes it, three paragraph tags. So each of these three paragraph tags would actually get styled only, excluding the ones that come before the div tags and also the ones within the div tags. They wouldn't get styled at all. This would only style the child selector that comes after the parent selector. So let me just make this obvious by giving some spacing. So you can see right here, this p tag is after this div. Before this div is this p tags here, which are 2 in number, and then this heading 3. But after the div tag, which is this one, you have this p tag right here. After this div is this p tag right here, that's this one. And lastly, after this div is this p tag here also. So the p tags that come after the parent selector are only going to be the elements that will get styled using the addition combinator. And we can also use this with a class name or an ID name. So here we'll be using the class name of div2. Comment this out, uncomment this. So this we have the addition symbol or the plus symbol. Now if we save this, before going to our browser, we check the HTML, and you can see that this particular div with this class name of div2 actually has only one paragraph after it, and it also has one before, which is okay, which is the one on top. So I think we all know which paragraph out of the two would actually get styled, and obviously it's going to be the one after this div with a class of div2. So going back to our browser, we should only see this style affecting just one paragraph. And yes, we have it here. So this particular div tag has a background of blue with the font color of white, and we have a div just right above it and below. I mean a paragraph here and here. So that's how the adjacent sibling selector works. So it only works with the child selector that comes after the parent selector. So for the last selector, we'll be seeing the general sibling selector. So we'll also be making use of the general div, which we already had before. So this would actually change to the slide symbol, which is this. And if we save this, now this particular combinator actually feels the same with the adjacent sibling, but then there are some differences we would notice when we view this on the browser. So going back to the browser, now we have three p tags that are styled, and I would explain how this actually happens. So right here, this is the first div, and before this div is this paragraph here, that's this one. So this particular p tag comes directly before this div, and also we have another p tag that comes directly after this div. So if you go back to our browser, you would notice that these two divs here, I mean these two paragraph elements here are not styled, but then the only ones that are styled are this one that comes after this div and this one inside. No, okay, no, this doesn't get styled. Okay, so actually this particular paragraph tags above the div doesn't get styled. It only styles the tag that comes after the div, which is this one, this particular p tag here, and it also styles this one. So what this styles is, its styling is quite similar to what you call the neighboring element. So any element that is a child selector that is a neighbor to this element would actually get styled. So if we go back to the browser, we have the last p tag here being styled, and we also have another p tag here being styled also. So here we have this particular p tag being styled. So what this styling actually does is that it doesn't style the immediate neighbor, but it styles like the neighbor after the element after the immediate surrounding element. So this won't affect this p tag here. It will only affect this one, this particular p tag here. Okay, so I hope we understand how this works. Okay, probably because this example is not really solid. So let me try adding another p tag to make this easier. Okay, so what I said before was that it actually styles any neighboring element that surrounds it. So surrounding this div here is this particular paragraph tags. But unlike the previous one, the sibling selector, it only styles the one that comes directly after it. So with the sibling selector that we learnt about before, this p tag that comes directly after this div would only get styled even when you have numerous p tags. Even when you have numerous p tags added. So if we have numerous p tags, it would style all the neighboring tags surrounding the particular parent selector. So if we save this, we would have all p tags that will come after every div tag to be styled. But then the difference between the general sibling selector and the adjacent sibling selector is the fact that the adjacent sibling selector would only select the direct neighbor, which is this first paragraph we have here, this particular one. So this one would only be the paragraph to get styled. So this four we have here would not get styled at all. But then the general sibling selector, which we are currently learning about, would actually style all neighboring child selectors. So the more paragraph elements we have here, the more they would actually get styled because it styles them in general. That's the general children selector that surrounds it. But then as opposed to the sibling selector only styles the direct surrounding element. So I hope with this we have a good idea of how this selector works. But then I think I'll just need to go over the adjacent sibling and the general sibling. So what we'll do now is we'll change this to the plus. So you can see what I said before. So now we've gone back to the adjacent sibling selector. And like I said before, for that selector, it only styles the direct neighboring element that has been chosen. So here we've actually chosen the p tag to be the child selector, which is what we defined in our styling. But then using the adjacent sibling selector, it would only choose a p tag that is a direct neighbor to this div tag here. So here we have this first p tag, and this p tag is a direct neighbor to this div. So using the adjacent sibling selector, you would only have this to be styled. But if we change this to the slide combinator, which is used by the general sibling selector, you would have every div that surrounds the every p element that surrounds this div tag to be styled. So this styling now will affect all of them that are under this direct neighbor. So I hope with this we have good understanding on how the combinators work, and also on how the different selectors use each of these combinators. So without wasting time, let's move on to the next section. So in this section, we'll be learning about pseudo elements and pseudo classes. So here we have the first part of this section, which is on pseudo elements. So what is a pseudo element? A pseudo element is a keyword attached to a selector that lets a user style a specific part of that selected element. So the pseudo element here is just basically the element, the selector itself, but then there will be a keyword attached to it. So the moment this keyword is attached to it, it actually lets a user style a specific part of this, selected element. So how this basically would be is that it would be in such a way that, all the stylings we've been doing, like if you can imagine, if you style a p tag, for instance, the style you defined would actually affect the entire p tag. And so, the p tag is a block level element which takes the entire line. So if the content is more than that line, it goes on to the next line, to the next line, like that in the block form. And whatever styling you define affects those number of lines you have. But here with a pseudo element, you can actually decide which line of that p tag you want to style, and I'll show you how to, do that. But let's move on. So here we have the syntax of the pseudo element, and it starts with the selector, which is followed by a double colon, not a single colon. You can see that there are two colons here. Then after this is the pseudo element itself, and then you can have your property and your value, which we all know is under CSS styling. So examples of pseudo elements we have in CSS can be seen below, but they are not limited to this, because actually the pseudo elements that are in CSS are a lot. Like, they are really, really a lot, probably up to 20 or 30 of them. But then for the sake of this, we'll just be looking at, these basic ones. And these particular pseudo elements we can see are one of the most popular ones that we have in CSS, that are also used by, you know users. So the first pseudo element we have is the after pseudo element, which is followed by the before pseudo element. Also, we have the first line pseudo element, which is followed by the first letter pseudo element, and we have lastly the selection pseudo element. So I'll be showing, you know you guys, how this particular pseudo element would actually make your styling look very, very precise and different from all what we've been doing before. So for the first pseudo element, we have the after pseudo element. And the after pseudo element is used to insert some content after the content of the specified element. So that's basically what this element actually does. You can use it to, you know, insert a particular content after the content of a specified element. That's the content that is being rendered by that element. You can add a content to it after it has been rendered. And here is a quick example which isn't very precise, but then you can see that the selector we use here is the paragraph selector, and it has the double colon which is followed by the after, which is the pseudo element itself. And then you would have, this is exactly how you will have it to be on VS Code. So you, the content here is the property, and the value here is the content from the user, which basically means the actual content you want to add to, the specified element when it is being rendered on the browser. So next we have the before pseudo element. So the before pseudo element is quite the opposite of the after pseudo element, and this particular pseudo element is used to add some content before the content of the specified element. So unlike the after pseudo element, for that it adds the content after the element's content, but for this it adds its own content before the content of that element. So we'll be seeing all of this practically later on. And here we have a very brief example, which we, here we'd also make use of the p tag or the p selector or p element, which is followed by the double colon. Then you have the before, which is a pseudo element, and within the content here, you can actually add any content you want. So this is exactly how it would be on VS Code. The property here would be the content, and the content from the user would be the value you want to add before the content of that specified element. So lastly, we have, okay, second to the last actually, we have the first line pseudo element. And so the first line pseudo element is used to add a specific style to the first line of a text. Now, this might not be necessarily a text, but then it's actually going to style the first line of any text element. As we all know, the popular text elements we have mostly is the p tag, the heading tags, the small tag, the big, the strong, anything that is just used to hold text within itself can actually use this pseudo element to style the first line of that text. So as opposed to how we've been doing styling before, where we style the entire element, here you can actually get a chance to style just the first line, which is the very first line where the element's content is being rendered. Now, a quick note for this particular pseudo element. This particular pseudo element can only be applied on block level elements. So this basically means that you can't have this to be used on inline elements, as if you try that, it's not going to work. So it's only used with block level elements. And also, the only properties you can define when using this particular element would be just the font, color, background, word spacing, letter, some of those basic text styling, and not anything more than that. So here we have a very brief example, still using the p element followed by the double colon and then the first line. So here you can see we've actually given the color of red to this. So what this would actually do on VS Code is that the moment we render a paragraph element that has a text that is more than the first line of the screen, which by that we all know that it would overflow to the second line and third line and so on. This would only affect just the first line. So you would only have the first line, the color of the text of the first line to be in red ink, and for the rest they would retain the default color, which is black. So we'll be seeing all of this on VS Code. And also, like I said before, the first line pseudo element only works with text properties. So the basic text properties like the font, the color, background, word spacing, line height, and some of those things are the only things you can use here. So you can't add things like padding, margin, what else, borders, float, display. You can't add all those, all those properties here. It strictly works with just text properties. So lastly, we have the first letter pseudo element. So the first letter pseudo element is used to style the first letter of the first line of a block element. So using this pseudo element would actually style the very first letter in the entire line that is being rendered on the screen. And this particular pseudo element can only be applied on block level elements. So this cannot work with inline, it only works with block. So that means you'd probably be using this with just the p tags, the heading ones, probably the divs, and not span, big, strong, italize, emphasize, sub and sub. You won't be doing those with this particular pseudo element and also the previous one. So here a very brief example also, and it begins with the p tag followed by the double columns and the first letter pseudo element. And you can see within the braces we have the color property giving the value of red. So what this would actually do when you know written in VS Code is that the very first letter of the text would actually have a red color as opposed to the other letters that follow it. And mind you, like I said before, the pseudo elements are a lot. So there's also probably a pseudo elements that can be used to style the second letter and also the second line. But that should be, I think that's it in terms of line and letters. I'm not sure it goes, further down. Like, it just sticks with just the first line and second line, first and second letter. So it doesn't have a pseudo element of third letter, fourth letter, fifth letter. No, it doesn't have that. So it just probably just has the first and second letter, and that's all. And this particular pseudo element also works with text properties. So, like I explained before in the first line pseudo element, this works with the font properties, the color, the background, the margin, padding. Oh, sorry, not the margin, padding, the font, the color, the background, text decoration, line height, and all that stuff, all those other text properties. Okay, so it seems we still have one more, which is the selection pseudo element. So the selection pseudo element styles the part of an element that is being selected by the user. So what this would do is that it's going to style the particular part of the entire content that the user selects on the screen. So we'll be seeing how this actually works on VS Code later on. But let's move on. And here under the example, we have a very brief one too, still making use of the p tag also, and also the double colons and the selection pseudo element. And we have the color here to be assigned the value of blue. So what this would do is that the particular part a user selects, the color of that part that is being selected by the user would have a color of blue the moment you select it. So we'll actually see how this works on VS Code. So here, a quick demo on how the pseudo elements work. You know what we do here without wasting time. We go back to VS Code and try all what we've learned out. So we are back to VS Code where we learnt about, combinators. So we'd actually be commenting all of this. We wouldn't be making use of them. Let's just get rid of all. So we'll be having the p tag first. Then we'd have some very long text. So we just use the lorem some. And mind you, this is just a random text generator. So don't really focus on the fact that you can't understand the language. But here we are trying to focus on how each of these pseudo elements actually work. So if we save this and go back to our browser, okay, so probably zoom this out a bit, and also would still add some content to make, multiple lines of text. So now we have this. Well, this should be enough. So if we go back to our browser, yeah, so we have up to 4 lines of text on the screen here. So for this, we'd be trying out the after pseudo element. So right here, we give this a class name, p1, and in our style.css, actually have this to be .p1, then the double colon and after. So you can see that right here you have a list of them, of pseudo element. There are a lot of them here. So that's why I said we can't really go through all, but then the ones we are going through are like the basic ones and the ones that you probably want to use when you start, developing websites. So here we'll be using the after pseudo element. And for this, we'll be adding any content of our choice. So let's add sale virtual program. Okay, so I didn't want to save this, but then if you go back to the browser, you would see that the very first line actually begins with the lorem ipsum and it ends with the reprehend. Okay, I'll probably change that to English so we'd understand how this works. So let's just change this to selectors. So now the very last line and the last text we have under the p tag is selectors, but then after the selectors we should have this particular text we have here. So if we save this and go back to our browser, okay, it doesn't seem to pick up. Okay, so this doesn't work at all. I'm really surprised.
So can you check if it's because of that space between that class name P and that
Okay,
pseudo
yeah, so
symbol?
I just did that now. I think this should be in, it should be a string text. So here would have this to be in double quotes. Okay, yeah, thank you. So the space actually, was what caused the error. So you can see that with CSS, you need to actually be very, very careful because any little space, any little missing of, symbols or any wrong syntax can actually cause error for the entire, program. So here we have the sale virtual program being added at the end of this particular text here. And if we should change this to before, you would actually see this text here at the very beginning before this lorem ipsum. So we change this to before, and this particular text would be before the lorem ipsum text we have. So yes, that's how we have it here on the screen. So that's the content we have right here. So without wasting our time, let's quickly try out the first line and first letter. So for the first line, we wouldn't be adding content there since it doesn't use this particular kind of property. So now we'll be giving the first line a background, or let's just give it a color of red. So what this would do is that the text on the very first line would have red ink and the rest would maintain the default color, and would also increase the size of the font to 40 pixels. So if I save this and go back to the browser, yes, so now we have the entire first line to be in red ink completely. So this is what the first line pseudo selector, um pseudo elements actually does. And lastly, we'll be seeing the first letter. So you would know that this should actually make change to the L we have on the screen. That's the very first word of lorem. The L here would actually be the one to have the changes and not the entire line. I think this is meant to be font size. You can also change the font family because by default it's actually using the Times New Roman. So we'll be using something different here. Yeah, so I believe we all know what the font family is. It's like the handwriting of, you know, HTML. So this is where you get to decide how you want the text to appear, the kind of writing you would want. So for this, we'll be using the Frank Gothic medium, and this should only style the L we have on the screen. So here, so now you can see the L here is in red ink and it has a very big size of 40 pixels, and it also uses a different font family. So this is how you'd have it with the um first letter pseudo element. So I think the last one we have is the selection. Save, come back here, and now nothing seems to happen. But then watch this. Just watch this. Now you can see that as I keep selecting elements, they actually take the red ink. So this particular one doesn't have an it doesn't have an obvious styling except you decide to select that particular content that holds this pseudo element. So the moment we begin to select any content here, they would all have the red ink. So this is how this particular pseudo element actually works. So like I said before, there are a lot of them. these are just the basic ones, and these are what one of the few things that these basic ones can do. There are some other pseudo elements out there that can allow you to do even more technical stuff aside from just changing the first line or highlighting with a different color, or some of these basic things. There are just a lot out there. So I'll probably employ you all to just go online, go through them, see how they all work, see how they perform, see what they can be used for, because it just might be useful for you at the end of the day. So I think that's that for pseudo elements. And lastly, we'll be touching pseudo classes. So here we are in the last section of today's class, which is the pseudo classes. What is a pseudo class? A pseudo class is a keyword that is attached to a selector by a user in order to define a special state for the selected element. So the pseudo class is quite different from the pseudo element. The pseudo element, styles a particular part of the element, but here this actually this doesn't style like your normal styling. This is actually used to add a special state, or what you would call a special effect on that selected element. So we'll see how this actually plays out. Yeah, so here we have a very brief syntax, and it's quite similar with the pseudo element. The only difference here is that it uses a single colon and not the double colon. And we also have this to be pseudo class after the colon. Before the colon, we have the selector, that is going to be the particular element we'll be styling. And this also has its property and value. So here we'll be seeing the examples of pseudo classes we have in CSS, which can be seen below, but they are also not limited to this number. So from my own understanding, pseudo elements and pseudo classes are actually a lot. In fact, they are probably almost the same number. And you could also, when you do your personal research, you would also see that some particular pseudo elements also have their pseudo class counterparts. For instance, the dot first line, the first line pseudo element we saw before, also has a first line pseudo class. So that's how the pseudo elements and the pseudo classes appear. There are actually a lot of them, and we can't go through every one of them. But then I'll try to go through the basic ones. So here we have the link pseudo class. We also have the active pseudo class, which is followed by the hover pseudo class, and also the visited pseudo class. Now, I want you to understand this. This particular pseudo classes we have here, they only work for the anchor tag, that's the A tag. So what this basically means is that among all the pseudo classes we have, some of these pseudo classes are under a particular group. So that means some of these pseudo classes can only style a particular element. So I think for pseudo elements, they can probably style different, elements, and some of them can only style block level element. That's for pseudo elements. But for pseudo class, some of them can only work for a particular element. So if you try doing this on another element, it won't work. So here we have the list of pseudo classes that only work for the anchor tag, that's the A tag. And as we all know, the anchor tag is the tag you use to, to link, to actually direct yourself to another part of the entire HTML document or to an external source. So first we have the link pseudo class. So the link pseudo class selects and styles all unvisited links. So as we all know, the A tag, which is also the anchor tag, is also known as a link tag. And that's because it is used to link different pages together. It allows you to visit a particular page within an HTML document, or an external source, which could be an external website, or you know an external part of that entire space. So here we have a quick and brief example, and it begins with the A selector, which is also the anchor tag name itself, and it's followed by the single colon and then the link, which is a pseudo class, and we have the property and the value, which is the background giving the value of green. So what this will do on VS Code is that it's going to give the background of all unvisited anchor tags the green color. So the background of any anchor tag that hasn't been visited would have a green color. Next, we have the active pseudo class. And this active pseudo class would select and style the active link. So this would probably work when you have multiple links and you decide to click on one of them. The moment you click on that link becomes active and automatically the background becomes green. So this wouldn't affect all
Hello, sir.
yeah.
Hello, sir.
Is someone
Hello,
receiving
sir.
a call?
Hello,
So
sir. Because,
oh, well, okay, by the way, we all know how the active pseudo class works, so we'll be seeing this later on VS Code. So next we have the hover pseudo class, which is my favorite actually. So the hover pseudo class selects and styles a link when you move the mouse over the content of that element. So this would actually give the anchor tag a special effect the moment you put the mouse above it. That's the moment you use the cursor to touch that element. And here we have a brief example which begins with the anchor tag, a single colon, and then the hover pseudo class. And it has a property of background which has the value of green. And lastly, we'll be seeing the visited pseudo class. So the visited pseudo class selects and style all visited links. So any link you've clicked on before would actually have a styling under this particular pseudo class. And for the example here, it's very brief. The anchor tag has a pseudo class of visited, and the background here is green. So this particular styling initially would not affect any anchor tag yet, but the moment you click on that link, it gives it a background of green color immediately. So we'll be seeing how all this actually plays out on VS Code. So mind you, like I said before, this particular pseudo classes only work with the anchor tag. So you should know that by now you would only be doing this with the anchor tag. And also the pseudo classes are they must be arranged in a particular order for them to work. So I'll be showing you guys the order of their arrangement. So without wasting time, let's move on. So here we'll have a quick demo on how the pseudo classes work. So we'll be heading back to VS Code one more. So for the sake of this, we wouldn't be making use of this p tag anymore. And also this wouldn't be needed. So here we are going to have several anchor tags. This would probably lead us to, let's just have a lot of them. So I think for the sake of this, we'd actually be needing another HTML file to actually make this easier to understand. So we'll create a new HTML file, call this main.html. And so change, okay, we have this already. Use the boilerplate. So now we'll be changing these links to be www dot say Facebook. I'll call the next one Jumia. The next one would be having the HTML we just created. So this would be main.html.
Check that Jumia. The .com is not completed.
Oh yeah, yeah. Thank you. So comment this. I think four anchor tags should be enough for this. So we'll save this and go back to our browser. Okay, we don't have this yet, and that's because we didn't give this actual text. So this will be Google, Facebook, Jumia, and our neighboring HTML file for this main. Okay, so now we have the Google, Facebook, the Jumia, and the main files. Okay, just wanted to know if that works. So here we have this. So the next thing we'll do now would be to style them using the pseudo classes. Okay, before then, let's also create something that would actually redirect us to the index.html if we get to this file. So for us to do that, we'd also create an anchor tag. In fact, let's copy all of this here. And so this would actually be changed to index.html. Let me see if this actually works. Going back to the browser, if we click on main, it should take us here. Click here again. Okay. Okay, we'll probably change this to index. So I hope you guys are seeing how you can actually connect two HTML files together using the anchor tags. So here we have our index.html, which is the one we've been using before. So if we click here, it will take us to the main. I can see now this is actually index. So clicking here will take us back to the index, which I've done already. Main index. So now we'll be styling our index.html using the pseudo classes. So like I said before, the pseudo classes we are using now only work with the anchor tag and not any other tag, at least for now. So you'd have this to be a single colon, and have the very first one, which is hover. Let's just define all of them to be visited. The next one would be link. Okay, and then the last one. Okay, let's just look into these three first. Okay, I think the last one is focus, right? Yeah. Okay, so now we have the four pseudo classes for the anchor tag. So, like I said before, they need
That the last one is active.
active. Oh, thank you. Wow, remember that. Okay, so we have visited, hover, active, and focus. So for the first one, we have the visited. So for this, would be applying styling of background color goes to blue. So if we save this now, let's just comment this out now. Now saving this, nothing would actually happen when we go back to the browser, and this is what I mean. So nothing actually happens here. But if we visit this and come back, it should actually change to blue color. Okay, that's because the color is already defined. So we have to, remove those properties it uses by default. Text decoration, none. If you say black color. Okay, so this is exactly how they all appear now. So now if we should use the hover pseudo class, let's try this out. For the pseudo class of hover, we would have a background color of red. So what this will do is that the moment we put the mouse on that particular um you know anchor tag, it should have a background color of red. I would also give this a color of white or wheat. Okay, so now you can see how the pseudo classes work. So it's used to give the anchor tags this particular effect. So the moment I have the cursor on any link, it would have a background of red color and also a color of wheat. So this is what happens when you hover over those particular anchor tags. So you probably would want, you've probably seen this on some websites before. I know a lot of websites that use this particular um hover pseudo class. So the next one would be, okay, let's try active. So this active would actually style the one that we clicked on but is currently active on the browser. So here would give this a background color. What color should I use? Probably blue violet and the color of green. Yeah. So if we save this, okay, go back to our browser, it still maintains the hover effect we have here. But the moment we decide to click, you can see now for now I've already clicked on this link. But the reason why we are not being directed to the main.html page is because I've not removed my hand from the left click. So right now we've actually clicked on this link and it has become active, which is why it has a purple background and also a text of green color. So the moment I remove my finger, it actually takes us to this page. So that's how the active link works. So lastly, we have the visited, and yeah, let's let's try this visited. This visited is actually supposed to work when you click on a link and it takes you to another page, and when you get back to that page you should see a different color. We'll probably change this to brown, color of white. Okay. A color of, what color have we not touched? Yellow. So actually that thing that you saw that happened was actually correct. And that's because we've actually clicked on the Google link. That was when I first tried to test it. Then we clicked on this Facebook, and we've also clicked on me. So the only link we've not clicked on now is Jumia. So what this basically means that these links that have yellow text color have been clicked on before. So this is the only link we've not clicked on. So the moment we click this, which will take us here, and we go back and reload this, you would actually have everything to be on yellow background. So this is what the pseudo class of visited actually does. So I think that's with pseudo classes. I think we still have one more. So this should be link. So this particular one actually styles all unvisited links. So even if we give this a background color of, let's say, aqua, you wouldn't notice any change on the website, on our document, I mean, at all. There's nothing here now. So what I'll do is I'm going to add a new link that we've not visited at all. So we'll copy this out. And this is a new link we've not visited. I'll change this to some other thing, nba.com. So if I save this, you should actually see it have a different background as opposed to the others. Okay, that's because I've not saved the HTML file or the CSS. Oh, this isn't picking up. Gray color. Save this. So back here, It's still not responding and I don't know why. Okay, sorry, we have this to be in the main.html instead of the index. So that's why. So this is where we are supposed to have this. Yes. And now if we go back to our browser, yes, so now we have this to have a gray background and with a color of black, but the moment we hover on it, the color changes to, with color. So that's how the pseudo classes of focus, link, visited, and active actually work with the anchor tag. And like I said before, the pseudo classes are more than these four, but these four can only be used with this anchor tag. So you probably would have other pseudo classes that work with other tags too, like your input, your forms. You would obviously see them when you research online. So I think that's that. Thank you, and that's the end of this class.